It should not have started, not after everything they tried. The rotor blades were still, frozen against the pale morning sky, as if the helicopter itself had given up long before anyone on the ground was willing to admit it. A circle of technicians stood around it, tools in hand, their faces tight with frustration, each of them avoiding eye contact with the others because they all knew the same thing, but no one wanted to say it out loud. This was not supposed to happen. Not here. Not under this kind of pressure. The aircraft was not just another machine waiting for routine maintenance. It was a critical asset, grounded at the worst possible moment, and every passing second stretched the silence thinner. Someone had already tried cycling the power systems twice. Another had gone through the ignition sequence step by step, slower the second time, as if patience alone could fix what logic could not. A third technician knelt by an open panel, staring at a cluster of wires as though the answer might reveal itself if he looked long enough. It did not. The air carried the faint smell of fuel and heated metal, and somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with a voice that sounded increasingly impatient, though no one responded. They could not. There was nothing left to report except failure. Then, without warning, the stillness broke. A sharp mechanical click echoed from deep within the helicopter's frame, subtle but unmistakable. Heads turned instantly. Hands froze mid-motion. The lead technician, Mark Sullivan, straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing as if he did not trust what he had just heard. For a brief second, no one moved, as though the entire group had silently agreed not to react too quickly, not to get their hopes up again. And then it happened. The engine turned. Once. Then again. A low, rising hum filled the air, hesitant at first, like something waking from a long and uncertain sleep. The rotor blades twitched, then began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, cutting through the silence that had held everyone captive just moments before. No one spoke. No one cheered. They simply stared, because every single person there knew exactly what made this moment impossible. They had done nothing differently. No new adjustments. No final attempt. No breakthrough fix. The helicopter had simply started. Mark took a step back. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something else he could not quite name. Around him, the others exchanged looks, searching for answers in each other's faces, but finding none. This was not how problems like this were solved. Not here. Not ever. And yet the machine was alive again, its steady rhythm growing stronger with each passing second, as if it had never been broken at all. Somewhere behind them, just out of frame, a man lowered his hand slowly, as though whatever he had just done required no acknowledgement. No announcement. No explanation. Most of the technicians had not even noticed him step forward. They had been too focused on failure to see anything else. But now, as the sound of the engine filled the space and the impossible became undeniable, a quiet realization began to settle over the group. This had not been an accident. It had not been luck. Someone had done something. And whoever that someone was, had just solved a problem that none of them could. Mark Sullivan was the first to move, but even then, it was not toward the helicopter, it was backward, as if distance might help him understand what he was seeing. His eyes locked on the spinning blades while his mind tried to retrace every step they had taken over the past hour, every failed attempt, every system check that had led nowhere, because something did not add up, something was missing, and he could feel it in the way the engine now settled into a steady, confident rhythm that had been completely absent before. And that was when he realized the most unsettling part of all. Nothing about the machine itself had changed, which meant the answer had not been in the machine to begin with. And that thought pulled his attention away from the helicopter and toward the people standing around it, scanning faces one by one, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint that someone else understood what had just happened. But all he found were the same expressions of confusion, reflected back at him, until his gaze landed on the man standing slightly apart from the group, quiet, still. The helicopter, not with surprise, not with relief, but with a calm certainty that felt completely out of place in a moment like this. And Mark frowned slightly, because he knew everyone on his team. He knew their roles, their habits, the way they reacted under pressure, and this man did not fit into any of it, which meant he had arrived after the problem had already begun, which meant he had not been part of the failed attempts. And that raised a question Mark did not like, because it suggested that the solution had come from outside the system they trusted. And before he could stop himself, He took a step forward and called out, his voice cutting through the sound of the engine, asking a simple question that carried more weight than it should have. Who just touched that panel? And the technicians exchanged quick glances, subtle shakes of the head, no one answering, because none of them had. They all knew exactly where they had been standing, what they had been doing, and none of it explained what they were now witnessing. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the growing realization that something important had been overlooked, and that was when a younger technician, standing near the edge of the group, hesitated before speaking, his voice uncertain, as if he was not sure whether what he was about to say even mattered. He said that someone had stepped in just before the engine turned, just for a second, not long enough to draw attention, not long enough to be questioned, and Mark's eyes snapped back to the man standing apart, the one who had not reacted like the others, the one who now seemed almost ready to leave, as if his presence had already served its purpose. And Mark felt a sharp shift in the atmosphere, because suddenly this was no longer about a mechanical failure. It was about a gap in awareness. A moment where everyone had been so focused on what was not working that they had missed the only thing that actually did. And that thought tightened his chest, because in his world, missing something like that was not just unusual, it was unacceptable. And yet here it was, right in front of him, undeniable, the helicopter running smoothly, the problem solved, and no one able to explain how, except for the quiet possibility standing just a few feet away, unnoticed until now. And for the first time since the engine started, Mark was not looking at the machine anymore. He was looking at the man, trying to understand not what he had done, but how someone like him had been invisible in a moment when everyone else had been desperate to be seen. The man did not rush to explain himself, and that, more than anything else, unsettled Mark Sullivan, because in a situation like this, anyone who had just solved an unsolvable problem would normally step forward, would normally take ownership, if only to confirm what had been done. But this man remained exactly where he was, calm, almost distant, as if the outcome mattered less to him than it did to everyone else standing there. And Mark felt a quiet pressure building in his chest, the kind that came not from failure this time, but from not understanding success, which in his world was far more dangerous, because failure could be analyzed, broken down, corrected, but this had no clear starting point, no visible process, and that made it harder to trust. And as the helicopter continued to run smoothly behind him, its steady sound now filling the space with a strange kind of reassurance, Mark took another step closer, his voice lower this time, more controlled, asking the man directly what he had done. And for a moment, the man did not answer, not because he was ignoring the question, but because he seemed to be considering it carefully, as if the answer itself was not as simple as the question suggested. And when he finally spoke, his voice was even, almost quiet. He said that he had not fixed anything. He had only corrected something small, something that had been slightly off. And the words hung in the air longer than expected, because they did not match the scale of what had just happened. And Mark narrowed his eyes slightly, because he had heard explanations like that before, the kind that sounded simple, but usually hid complexity underneath. And he pressed further, asking what exactly had been off. And the man glanced briefly toward the helicopter, then back at Mark, and said that sometimes machines did not fail loudly. Sometimes they drifted just enough to confuse everyone looking at them. And the problem was not in what people saw, but in what they assumed. And that answer did not satisfy Mark, not fully, but it did something else. It shifted the focus of the moment, because now this was not just about a technical solution. It was about perspective, about seeing something others had missed, and that realization drew the attention of the others closer, one by one, until the loose circle that had formed earlier began to tighten again, not around the helicopter this time, but around the man. And there was a subtle change in the way they looked at him. The doubt was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, something closer to curiosity. And before anyone could ask another question, the sound of approaching footsteps cut through the moment, steady, deliberate, and unmistakable, and the group instinctively shifted, creating space without being told, because they recognized the presence before they even saw it. And when General William Carter stepped into view, his expression already fixed with expectation, his eyes moved first to the helicopter, confirming what he had been told, that it was running again, that the problem had been resolved. And then his gaze moved across the group, reading the tension, the confusion, the unanswered questions, and finally it settled on the man standing quietly among them. And in that instant, something changed, not in the man, but in the room itself. Because the general did not look surprised, he did not look uncertain. He looked as though this outcome had been exactly what he expected all along. And without raising his voice, without adding any dramatic emphasis, he spoke a single line that carried more weight than anything said so far. He said, "It is about time you showed up, Reed," and the name landed differently than anything else had, because it was not just a name, it was recognition, it was confirmation. And Mark felt the shift immediately. The same man who had been invisible moments ago was now at the center of something none of them fully understood, and for the first time since the helicopter started, the question was no longer what had happened. It was who had been standing in front of them all along. The name did not echo loudly, but it carried through the group with a weight that was impossible to ignore, and Mark Sullivan felt it immediately, not because he recognized it, but because of the way General Carter said it, with a level of certainty and familiarity that did not match the man standing in front of them. And that contrast created a quiet tension that no one could quite explain, because everything about Thomas Reed's appearance suggested someone ordinary, someone who did not belong at the center of a moment like this. And yet the general's tone suggested the exact opposite, and that disconnect forced everyone present to reconsider what they thought they understood, because in their world, recognition from someone like General Carter was never given lightly. It was earned, it was deliberate, and it was always backed by something real. And as the silence stretched just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable, Reed gave a small nod, not overly formal, not dismissive, just enough to acknowledge the general's presence without drawing attention to himself. And that response, simple as it was, revealed something subtle but important. He was not intimidated. He was not surprised. He was simply present, and that presence felt grounded in a way that stood in contrast to the uncertainty surrounding everyone else. And Mark noticed it, the lack of urgency, the absence of any need to explain or defend what had just happened, and it unsettled him more than the failure had, because it suggested that Reed operated on a level of understanding that did not require validation. And before Mark could form another question, General Carter stepped closer, his eyes still on Reed, and asked quietly what they had missed, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, but as a genuine request for clarity. And that alone shifted the dynamic even further, because it was not common for someone in his position to ask that kind of question in that way. And Reed took a brief moment before answering, his gaze moving once more toward the helicopter, as if confirming that it was still running as expected. And then he spoke, his voice steady, explaining that the issue had never been a full system failure. It had been a misalignment, something small enough to be overlooked, but significant enough to prevent the entire system from functioning correctly. And he added that when multiple people worked on the same problem under pressure, they often reinforced each other's assumptions without realizing it. And over time, those assumptions became harder to question, even when the evidence did not fully support them. And Mark felt that statement land harder than he expected, because it was not just an explanation, it was a reflection of exactly what had happened. And he could see it now. The sequence of decisions, the shared conclusions, the gradual narrowing of perspective that had led them all in the same direction, away from the actual issue. And what made it worse was that none of it had been careless, none of it had been rushed. It had all been logical, step by step, which meant the problem was not in their effort, it was in their approach. And that realization created a quiet discomfort that no one voiced, but everyone felt. And General Carter nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already knew. And then he turned his attention briefly to the rest of the group, his expression calm but firm, and said that sometimes experience did not announce itself, sometimes it waited until it was needed. And when it did, it often looked different than expected. And his words were not directed at anyone specifically, but they carried a clear message, one that shifted the atmosphere from confusion to reflection. And as the helicopter continued to run smoothly behind them, no longer the center of attention, but still a constant reminder of what had just occurred, Mark realized that the situation had changed in a way he had not anticipated, because the problem they had been trying to solve was no longer the most important part of the moment. What mattered now was understanding how it had been solved so quietly, by someone they had not even considered. And as he looked at Reed again, really looked this time, not as an outsider, but as someone who had just altered the outcome of everything. He understood that whatever came next was not going to be about the machine, it was going to be about the man, and more importantly, about why someone like him had been forgotten in the first place. The weight of the moment did not fade. It shifted, settling into something quieter but far more uncomfortable. Because now that the immediate problem was gone, there was nothing left to distract from the realization that everyone standing there had missed something that one man had seen in seconds, and Mark Sullivan could feel that realization pressing in from every direction, not as blame, but as a question he could not answer. And that question followed him as he stepped closer again, this time not as the lead technician trying to fix a machine, but as someone trying to understand a gap in his own thinking. And he asked Reed what exactly he had noticed first, not the solution, not the correction, but the very first thing that told him something was wrong in a different way than everyone else believed. And Reed did not respond immediately, his eyes briefly tracing the outline of the helicopter as if replaying the moment in his mind. And when he spoke, he said that it was not what he saw, it was what he did not hear, and that answer caused a slight pause in the group, because it did not fit into the way they had been approaching the problem. And Reed continued, explaining that machines often reveal their condition through patterns, through consistency, and when something breaks, that pattern changes. But in this case, the pattern had not changed in the way it should have, which meant the failure was not complete, it was partial, and that distinction was important, because a complete failure leads you to search for missing function, but a partial failure requires you to question alignment. And as he spoke, Mark could feel the explanation connecting to the earlier attempts, to the checks they had performed, the systems they had tested, all of which had pointed them toward a deeper issue that did not actually exist. And what made it more difficult to accept was how simple the correction sounded when Reed described it. A slight adjustment, a recalibration that took less than a minute once you knew where to look. And that was when one of the other technicians, unable to hold back his frustration, asked why none of them had seen it. Why a group of trained professionals had all reached the same wrong conclusion. And Reed did not answer with criticism, he answered with something far more direct. He said that they had all been listening for the wrong thing. And that once a group agrees on what a problem should sound like, it becomes harder to recognize when reality does not match that expectation, and the words settled into the space with a clarity that no one could easily dismiss, because it was not an attack, it was an observation, one that applied to all of them equally. And Mark felt a quiet shift in his perspective, not just about the situation, but about the way he approached problems in general, because for the first time, he understood that experience alone was not enough if it led you to expect the same patterns every time. And as that thought settled, General Carter stepped forward again, his attention still on Reed, and asked a question that seemed simple but carried a deeper meaning. He asked how long it had taken Reed to notice the difference, and Reed answered without hesitation. He said a few seconds, maybe less, and there was no pride in his voice, no attempt to emphasize the speed or the skill involved. Just a straightforward response, and that simplicity made it even more impactful, because it highlighted the gap between what had taken the team over an hour and what had taken him almost no time at all. And as the group stood there, processing that difference, the atmosphere shifted once more, not back to tension, but towards something quieter, something closer to respect, though not fully formed yet, because respect requires understanding, and understanding was still catching up. And as Mark looked at Reed again, he realized that the real question was no longer how the helicopter had been fixed. It was how someone capable of seeing what others could not had ended up standing on the outside, unnoticed, until the moment he was needed. And that question lingered in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore. The question lingered longer than anyone expected, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it pointed to something none of them had considered until now. And Mark Sullivan could feel it settling in his thoughts, the idea that someone with this level of awareness had been standing just outside their field of vision, not hidden, not unavailable, just unrecognized. And that realization carried a different kind of weight, one that had nothing to do with mechanical systems, and everything to do with how people were seen or overlooked. And as he glanced briefly toward General Carter, he noticed that the general had not moved, had not shifted his stance or expression, as if this entire sequence had unfolded exactly as expected. And that detail caught Mark's attention, because it suggested that this was not a coincidence. It was a decision, and before he could connect that thought fully, the general spoke again, his voice steady, measured, and directed not just at Reed, but at everyone present. He said that there was a reason he had asked for Thomas Reed by name, and that reason was not based on rank or recent service or visibility within the current structure. It was based on something far less obvious, but far more reliable. And as he paused briefly, allowing the words to settle, the group instinctively leaned into the moment, not physically, but mentally, because now the focus had shifted completely, no longer on the helicopter, no longer on the failure, but on the man who had resolved it. And General Carter continued, explaining that years ago, long before most of the people standing here had taken on their current roles, there had been situations where standard procedures had failed, where systems had behaved in ways that did not match their design. And in those moments, solutions had not come from manuals or checklists. They had come from individuals who understood the difference between what a system was supposed to do and what it was actually doing. And Reed had been one of those individuals, not because he followed a different set of rules, but because he knew when the rules no longer applied. And as the general spoke, there was no exaggeration in his tone, no attempt to dramatize the past, just a clear, direct acknowledgement of experience that had been proven over time. And Mark found himself listening more closely than before, not out of obligation, but because something about this explanation connected the present moment to a larger pattern, one that made the outcome feel less surprising and more inevitable. And when the general finished, there was a brief silence, not empty, but reflective. And it was Reed who broke it, not with a statement, but with a simple observation. He said that most problems are not new. They only appear new to the people encountering them for the first time. And that line shifted something again, because it reframed the entire situation, turning what had felt like an isolated failure into part of a broader continuum of experience. And Mark felt that shift clearly, because it explained something he had struggled to articulate earlier, the gap between effort and outcome, between what they knew and what they had missed. And as he looked at Reed once more, the image had changed, not in appearance, but in meaning. The same man who had seemed out of place now carried a context that made his presence make sense, and that change did not come from anything Reed had done to present himself differently. It came from the information that had been revealed, from the recognition that had been given, and that realization brought with it a subtle but undeniable adjustment in the way everyone stood, the way they listened, the way they thought about what had just happened, because respect, even when it begins quietly, has a way of reshaping a moment without needing to announce itself. And as the sound of the helicopter continued behind them, steady and consistent, Mark understood that what they had just witnessed was not just a solution. It was a reminder, one that extended beyond the machine in front of them, reaching into how they defined expertise, how they recognized it, and how easily it could be overlooked when it did not match expectations. And that thought stayed with him, not as a conclusion, but as something still unfolding, because the more he considered it, the clearer it became that this moment was not the end of a problem. It was the beginning of a different kind of understanding, one that would not be as easy to ignore the next time it appeared. The shift in understanding did not arrive all at once. It settled gradually, like a new layer forming over everything that had just happened, and Mark Sullivan could feel it changing the way he processed even the smallest details, the sound of the engine, the posture of the technicians, the quiet confidence in Thomas Reed's presence. All of it now carried a different meaning, and yet, despite that growing clarity, there was still something unresolved, something that did not fully align, because if Reed's experience was as significant as General Carter had suggested, then his absence from the team, his position outside the immediate chain of operations, did not make sense. And that question began to take shape in Mark's mind, not as doubt, but as curiosity that refused to fade. And he was not the only one, because the others, though silent, were beginning to show the same signs, subtle glances, brief hesitations, the kind of nonverbal cues that indicated a shared realization. And it was one of the senior technicians who finally gave voice to it, asking why someone like Reed was not already part of their team, why his knowledge had not been integrated into their current systems. And the question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. And for the first time since his arrival, Reed did not answer immediately, not because he was avoiding the question, But because the answer required more than a simple explanation, and before he could respond, General Carter stepped in, not to interrupt, but to provide context that Reed himself seemed unwilling to offer, and the general's voice remained calm. But there was a subtle shift in tone, something more reflective, as he explained that not all expertise fits neatly into structured roles. That sometimes the very qualities that make someone effective in unpredictable situations also make them difficult to place within rigid systems. And as he spoke, the group listened with a different kind of attention, because this was no longer about a single event. It was about how the system itself recognized and used experience. And the general continued, saying that Reed had spent years operating in environments where conditions changed faster than procedures could be updated, where decisions had to be made based on observation rather than instruction, and over time, that kind of experience shaped the way he approached problems, not through standard processes, but through patterns that were not always easy to document or teach. And Mark felt that explanation resonate, because it connected directly to what they had just witnessed, the difference between following a checklist and recognizing when the checklist no longer applied. And as that realization settled, Reed finally spoke, his voice steady, not defensive, not dismissive, simply honest. He said that there had been opportunities to stay within the system, to take on roles that were more visible, more defined, but that those roles did not align with how he worked, and over time, it became easier to step away than to try to fit into something that did not fully make use of what he knew. And the simplicity of that statement carried a weight that no one could ignore, because it suggested that his absence was not the result of being overlooked entirely, but of a mismatch between capability and structure. And that idea introduced a different kind of tension, one that had nothing to do with failure or success, but with how systems evolve and what they sometimes leave behind. And Mark found himself considering that more deeply than he expected, because it challenged a fundamental assumption, that expertise would always rise to the surface, that the most capable individuals would naturally occupy the most critical roles. And yet here was clear evidence that this was not always the case, that sometimes the most valuable insights existed just outside the formal structure, waiting to be recognized only when the situation demanded it. And as the helicopter continued to run smoothly behind them, no longer the focus, but still a constant reminder of the moment that had brought them here, Mark understood that the real impact of what had happened was still unfolding, not in the machine, but in the way each of them would think the next time they faced something that did not behave as expected. And as he looked at Reed once more, there was no longer any question about whether he belonged there. The only question that remained was how many times someone like him had been needed before, and no one had thought to ask. The question did not need to be spoken again for it to remain present. It lingered in the way everyone stood, in the silence that followed Reed's words, in the subtle shift from curiosity to something more deliberate, something closer to accountability. And Mark Sullivan could feel it clearly now, the understanding that what had just happened was not an isolated moment, but a reflection of something larger, something embedded in the way they operated. And as he looked around at the others, he saw that same realization beginning to take hold, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like a pattern forming where none had been noticed before. And it was in that quiet transition that Mark made a decision, not out of obligation, but out of a need to close the gap between what they had experienced and what they now understood. And he stepped forward again, this time with a different tone, less guarded, more open. And he asked Reed if he would walk them through it, not just the correction, but the thought process behind it, because understanding the outcome was no longer enough. They needed to understand the path that led to it. And Reed studied him for a brief moment, as if weighing the request, not in terms of difficulty, but in terms of whether it would be useful. And then he gave a small nod, signaling that he would. And without moving toward the helicopter immediately, he began by asking a question instead. He asked what each of them had assumed when the engine failed to start. And the responses came slowly at first, then more confidently: system malfunction, ignition failure, electrical inconsistency. Each answer reflecting the logical steps they had taken, the conclusions they had reached. And Reed listened without interruption, allowing each perspective to be fully expressed. And when they finished, he did not dismiss any of it. He acknowledged that every conclusion had been reasonable based on the information they had at the time. And that was important, because it reinforced that the issue had not been carelessness or lack of skill. It had been alignment, the alignment of assumptions. And then he asked them to consider a different starting point. What if the system had never fully failed? What if it had only shifted slightly out of sync? And that question created a pause, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it required them to reconsider everything they had already done. And Reed continued, explaining that in systems like this, small misalignments can create effects that appear much larger than they are. And when multiple indicators suggest a deeper problem, it becomes natural to focus on those indicators rather than question the underlying pattern. And as he spoke, Mark could see the connections forming. The earlier steps they had taken, the signals they had interpreted, all of it now fitting into a different framework. One that made the solution feel less like a sudden fix and more like a missed opportunity to look in a different direction. And Reed finally stepped closer to the helicopter, pointing out the exact area he had adjusted, not with emphasis, not as a demonstration of skill, but simply as a reference point. And he explained how the misalignment had disrupted the system's timing just enough to prevent startup, while still allowing all other indicators to appear normal. And that detail was what made it so easy to overlook, because nothing had appeared completely broken, just slightly off. And as the group listened, the earlier confusion began to resolve into clarity, not because the solution was complex, but because the path to it required a different way of thinking. And when Reed finished, there was no immediate response, no questions, just a shared understanding that settled over the group, quiet but unmistakable. And Mark realized that what they had gained in that moment was not just knowledge of a specific issue, but a shift in perspective that would carry forward, influencing how they approached future problems. And as he looked at Reed one more time, there was no longer any trace of uncertainty, only a clear recognition of the value that had been standing in front of them all along, waiting for the moment when it would finally be seen. The understanding did not arrive with noise or celebration. It settled quietly, the way truth often does when it finally becomes clear. And Mark Sullivan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes moving from the helicopter to Thomas Reed and then to the rest of the team, as if measuring the distance between what they had been and what they were beginning to become. And there was something different in that space now, something steadier, more grounded, not built on confidence alone but on awareness. And as the rotor blades continued their smooth rotation behind them, no longer a source of tension but a reminder of what had just been learned, General Carter took a slow step forward, his presence drawing attention without effort. And when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. He said that what they had witnessed was not just a repair. It was a demonstration of perspective, and that perspective was something that could not always be taught through standard training. It had to be recognized, valued, and when necessary, sought out. And his words were not directed at Reed. They were directed at everyone else. And Mark felt them land with a quiet certainty, because they did not challenge his ability. They expanded it. They pointed to something beyond skill, something that required a willingness to question even the most logical conclusions. And as that idea settled in, Reed took a small step back, not out of hesitation, but as if he understood that his role in this moment was already complete. And that was when Mark spoke again, not with a question this time, but with something closer to acknowledgement. He said that what Reed had shown them would change the way they approached problems moving forward. And the statement was simple, but it carried weight, because it was not just appreciation, it was recognition. And Reed gave a slight nod in return, not dismissing the words, but not holding on to them either, as if recognition was not something he depended on, only something he accepted when it came. And that detail stayed with Mark, because it revealed something deeper than experience. It revealed a kind of independence from validation, a focus on the work itself rather than the attention it might bring. And as the group began to shift, some returning to their positions, others lingering for just a moment longer, there was a subtle change in the way they carried themselves. The earlier tension had been replaced with something quieter, but more durable, a shared understanding that would not fade as quickly as the problem they had just solved. And General Carter turned slightly toward Reed, his expression unchanged but his tone carrying a note of finality. He said that there would always be a place for insight like that, whether it fit neatly into the system or not. And Reed responded with a simple acknowledgement, nothing more, nothing less. And then, without drawing attention, he began to step away, moving at the same unhurried pace with which he had arrived, not waiting for further questions, not expecting anything to follow. And Mark watched him go, not with confusion this time, but with a clarity that had not been there before, because now he understood that the most important part of what had just happened was not the machine, not the failure, not even the solution. It was the realization that value does not always stand at the center of attention. Sometimes it exists just outside it, waiting for the moment when someone is willing to look beyond what is expected. And as the sound of the helicopter continued behind him, steady and reliable, Mark knew that the next time something did not make sense, he would not just look harder, he would look differently. Because sometimes the answer is not hidden, it is simply overlooked, and once you understand that, you do not just solve problems, you begin to see them in a way you never did before.